Montana Territory, September 1878. The baby was crying again, sharp and raw against the wind that swept down from the Bitterroot Mountains. The tracks shivered under the weight of the coming train, but there was no one in sight, only her, standing alone, boots buried in the gravel, a bundle swaddled in her arms and a suitcase at her feet. The man who was supposed to come never showed. Beatrice Zeller gripped her shawl tighter around her shoulders, her knuckles white where they held the small baby close. The boy, barely 3 weeks old, was not hers, not by blood, not by choice. But she would not leave him, not now, not after everything that had happened. She looked down the track again, lips trembling, then pressed a kiss to the baby's head. "SHH," she whispered. "I won't let anything happen to you." Behind her, a wagon creaked to a stop on the dirt road that crossed the tracks. She turned, startled, just as the man driving climbed down. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a dust-worn hat pulled low and a rifle strapped to his saddle. His horse stamped the earth once, twice, then settled. He looked at her like he did not know whether to ask a question or draw his weapon. "You alone out here?" he asked finally. Beatrice stared at him, frozen for a moment. Then she nodded. The man stepped closer, his boots crunching the gravel. "That your baby?" "No," she said, voice low. "He was left in my arms and they ran. Train was supposed to take us south, but now," she blinked. "I do not know where to go." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached up, tipped his hat back, and said, "Name's Oran Keller. You can hop in. We're going home." She stared at him, stunned. "You do not even know me." "I know enough," he said. "You did not leave the boy." "That says something." Beatrice hesitated, then looked down at the baby. The boy had quieted, one small hand curled around the edge of her shawl. "I do not have anywhere else," she said finally. "Then we will figure it out," Oran said, already walking back toward the wagon. "Come on." She gathered her suitcase and followed. The wagon was plain, built for hauling feed and fence posts, not passengers. But Oran helped her up, made sure she was settled, then climbed up beside her. The baby stirred slightly as the wheels creaked into motion, but did not cry. They rode in silence for a while. The land stretched wide around them, golden fields, patches of pine, the railroad cutting a clean line through it all. The sun was just starting to sink behind the hills. "What is his name?" Oran asked after a while. "I gave him one," she said softly. "Paul." Oran nodded. "Good name." Beatrice leaned back, letting herself breathe for the first time in hours. They reached Oran's homestead just as dusk painted the sky. It was not a grand place, just a weathered cabin tucked against a split-rail fence, a shed, a small corral, and a pump out front. But it was clean, solid, and warm from the chimney smoke curling into the air. "I have a room you can use," Oran said as he helped her down. "It is not much, but it is yours." She swallowed the tightness in her throat. "Thank you." He nodded and led her inside. The cabin smelled of pine and ash. There was a fire already going in the hearth, and a pot of stew simmering on the stove. Everything was tidy. Boots lined up by the door, a rifle resting in the corner, fresh water drawn in a basin. Oran showed her to a small room at the back, just a cot, a quilt, and a window that looked out over the hills. "I will get more wood for the fire," he said. She nodded, lowering herself to the cot with Paul in her arms. The baby shifted, then fell asleep again, his breath warm against her neck. When Oran returned, she stood. "I should explain," she said, "about the baby, about why I was there." "You do not owe me anything," Oran said. "I do." Her voice broke a little. "I was a nursemaid. The family I worked for, they were supposed to take the baby south. Only when the time came, they handed him to me and ran. I waited like a fool, thinking they would come back, but they never did." Oran's eyes stayed on hers, calm, steady. "You stayed with him," he said. "That is what matters." Beatrice looked down at Paul. "I could not leave him." I would never. I believe you. She looked up again, surprised by the quiet certainty in his voice. You do not even know me, she whispered. I know enough. There was something in his voice, something firm, honest, not rushed. She felt it settle in her chest. They shared stew by the fire that night. Paul slept nearby in a basket lined with an old wool coat. Oran poured her warm tea, and when she said nothing for a while, he did not press. When she finally looked over at him, he was watching the flames. You live alone? She asked. He nodded. Since my father passed, I got cattle out back, a few acres. It keeps me busy. You never married? No, he said. Never found someone who wanted to stay. She sipped her tea. I never meant to end up here. Well, he said, you are here now. And you are not alone. She looked at him again, and this time she smiled. That night, as the wind swept across the plains and the baby slept without fuss, Beatrice lay awake listening to the creak of the cabin walls, the safety of her roof, the soft rhythm of Oran's footsteps in the other room. She did not know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in a long while, she was not afraid. The rooster crowed just once before the rest of the world stirred. Beatrice sat on the edge of the cot, boots already laced, her hair pinned back with a care born of habit. Paul lay nestled in the cradle. Oran had rigged from a rocking crate and a folded saddle blanket. His tiny fists opened and closed as he dreamed. She stepped into the main room quietly, unsure of her place. The fire had gone to embers overnight, but the stove still held a faint warmth. She was reaching for the kettle when a door creaked behind her. You're up early, Oran said, voice still rough from sleep. I didn't want to be in the way, she replied, not turning. He moved past her, reached for the kettle, and filled it himself. You're not. There's always work to be done. You ever milk a cow? She looked at him, a little caught off guard. I have, though it's been some years. Then you're better off than most, he said, setting the kettle on the stove. You want to come out and meet her? She hesitated only a moment, then nodded. Let me wrap the baby first. Outside, the air still held the hush of dawn. A low mist clung to the grass, and the barn stood outlined against a sky the color of riverstone. Oran led the way, pitchfork in hand, whistling low to a pair of cows already waiting near the gate. This one here's Mabel, he said, patting a brown and white hide. Stubborn as a preacher's daughter, but steady. Beatrice crouched beside the bucket, her skirt tucked back, and took up the stool without asking. A few minutes in, Mabel shifted her weight and blew out a slow breath, but Beatrice kept milking, her rhythm unbroken. You weren't lying, Oran said, watching from the side. I wouldn't waste a lie on a cow. He laughed, short, genuine, and unexpected. It sent a warmth through the morning chill. They finished with the milking and carried the pails back inside. Oran poured the milk into a crock while Beatrice checked on Paul, who'd begun to fuss. She lifted him gently, smoothing the creases in his blanket. You always quiet him that fast? Oran asked. I learned to read what each cry meant. He's a fretter before he's hungry. Smart woman. She glanced at him. You speak like someone who's lived too long with silence. He didn't answer that right away. Instead, he sat at the table and reached for a heel of bread. My ma passed when I was 16. After that, just me and my father. He wasn't a talker. She nodded, settling into the chair across from him. Paul nestled against her shoulder. I worked in houses where nothing was ever said aloud. Grief made them quiet, pride kept them that way. Oran tore the bread in half and offered her a piece. That your family's story too? I don't have one anymore. Not that ever counted me as theirs anyhow. The quiet stretched again, but it didn't feel sharp, just settled. What are you thinking of doing? He asked. Beatrice looked down at Paul, his breath soft against her collarbone. I'll earn my keep if you'll have me. I can cook, mend, tend the chickens. I don't mind hard work. He leaned back in his chair, eyes steady. It's not charity. I could use the help. She didn't flinch from the offer nor soften it with thanks. Instead, she nodded once. "I'll start with the washing. You've a line behind the house," he pointed with his chin, "and a washtub in the shed. It leaks some, but it'll hold." By midday, the line was heavy with steam-damp clothes, and Beatrice's sleeves were wet to the elbows. Paul dozed in a basket under the eaves, shaded and safe. Oran worked out at the fence line, hammering planks into place, his shirt damp with sweat and his hat pulled low against the sun. She watched him a moment, then turned back to her task, wringing out a shirt with firm, practiced hands. Later, as the wind picked up and the shadows began to stretch long, she found Oran sitting on the porch, rubbing his shoulder. "I can rub liniment on that," she said, standing just behind him. "I'd take it if you're offering." She went inside, fetched the tin from the shelf, and returned. He stayed seated as she knelt beside him and worked the salve into the muscle with firm, even pressure. "Where'd you learn to do that?" he asked, voice low. "There was a boy in the house I worked took a fall off a horse. The doctor never came, so I learned." "Folk like you hold a place together," he murmured. She didn't answer, just kept working the liniment in slow circles. When she finished, she sat back on her heels. "Thank you," he said. "You're welcome." As the last of the sun dipped behind the nearest ridge, she stood and dusted her hands. Paul stirred from his nap and she lifted him, cradling him against her hip. "We'll be all right here," she said suddenly, not sure why she'd spoken it aloud. Oran looked up at her, expression unreadable in the half-light. "Yeah," he said. "I think we will." They stood there a while, the silence between them no longer hollow, but full like something just beginning to take shape. The first frost came lightly, crisping the grass and silvering the edges of the corral fence. Beatrice stood near the pump, sleeves rolled, washing the last of the potatoes she'd pulled that morning. Paul was nestled in a sling against her, his small weight a familiar warmth against her ribs. He'd grown heavier in the weeks since they'd arrived, his gaze more alert, his cries more certain. Inside, Oran was repairing the stovepipe. The wind had changed the night before, and smoke had backed into the room until he'd yanked the door open and cursed under his breath. This morning, he'd gone to work with a wire brush and a length of rope, shoulders tense, jaw set. Beatrice walked in with the potatoes in her basket, pressing her shoulder to the door to close it against the wind. "You'll want to check the base," she said, setting the basket on the table. "Sometimes birds build in there, especially when the nights turn." He pulled his arm from the flue, soot streaked down to his elbow. "I didn't think of that. You learn to, after a winter or two. You had to figure that out yourself." She unlaced Paul from the sling and laid him in the cradle, brushing her hand over his chest until he settled. "The woman I worked for didn't know much about keeping a fire. I took it on once her husband stopped coming home." Oran nodded, then turned back to the pipe. "I never saw myself sharing a roof with anyone again, not after Pa passed. Thought the quiet suited me." Beatrice rinsed her hands in the basin, then dried them on her apron. "You don't mind it now?" He looked over his shoulder. "No, I don't." The stove hissed as he eased the pipe back into place. The fire crackled low and Beatrice knelt to feed it a split log. The warmth spread quickly, flushing her cheeks. "You ever think of leaving?" he asked. She sat back on her heels. "When I was younger, I thought I'd go east, maybe teach, maybe so. But the years kept folding in and I never did." "You'd have made a sharp teacher," he said. "I'd have had no patience for boys who cut class." He laughed, brushing ash from his hands. "I'd have been one of those boys. I don't doubt it." Paul stirred and let out a short cry. Beatrice crossed the room and lifted him with practiced ease, his head tucking beneath her chin. Oran watched her, his expression unreadable. "You've taken to him," he said. "I didn't plan to. But he's mine now, far as I'm concerned." He nodded once, then stepped outside, letting the screen door shut behind him. Beatrice watched him from the window as he crossed to the barn, shoulders hunched against the cold. He moved like someone used to solitude, but not unwilling to share space when it was offered. That afternoon, Oran returned with a hen tucked under one arm and a half-finished crate under the other. "Fox got the last of the others last winter," he said, setting the crate beside the hearth. Figured it was time to start again. Beatrice crouched beside the crate, Paul sleeping against her shoulder. The hen blinked up at her, feathers ruffled but clean. "She'll lay when she's ready, I'll keep her fed." He leaned against the wall, watching her. "I've never known a woman who didn't ask what I expected in return. I'm not most women." "No, you're not." She let the silence stretch, then stood slowly. "You ever think about what comes next, with you?" he asked. "With any of it?" He straightened. "Yeah. I do." She stepped closer, Paul still sleeping, and met his eyes fully. "You've given me a place. Not just a roof, but a way to breathe again. I wouldn't mind making it something lasting." He reached out, thumb brushing Paul's blanket as if testing the shape of the thought she'd spoken. "I've been thinking the same," he said. Outside, the wind moved through the pines like breath. Inside, Beatrice reached for his hand, not with hesitation but with quiet certainty. He took it. The first snow came soft and early, dusting the fields in white before the trees had fully lost their color. Oran had taken to setting traps along the ravine, bringing back rabbits and once a fat grouse that Beatrice plucked beside the fire while Paul gnawed a strip of apple in his cradle. Beatrice had begun sewing at night, piecing together scraps of muslin and wool from an old trunk Oran had pulled from the loft. She stitched in long, quiet stretches once Paul was down, her fingers nimble even as the light dimmed. Oran sanded fence posts across the room, the scrape of his knife steady, unhurried. "You had brothers?" he asked one evening without looking up. "No," she said, "just me. My father left when I was small. My mother worked in a shop pressing linens. We got by, but barely." He nodded, setting down the post. "You ever go into town?" "Not since I got here. I'll be heading in come Friday. Need grain and salt. Thought maybe you'd want to come along." She folded her stitching into her lap. "Wouldn't be a bad thing to see what's beyond the fields. There's not much. A mercantile, a smith, saloon farther off, but the women gather near the post office most Fridays. Might be good for you. For me, or for appearances." Her tone was mild, but her eyes sharp on his. "For you," he said, meeting her gaze. "You've been doing everything here without asking for anything. Thought you might want a breath of something different." She nodded slowly. "I'll come. Paul too, of course. We'll take the wagon. It's a half day there and back." That Friday they loaded early, the wagon bed lined with straw and extra quilts. Beatrice wrapped Paul in the thickest coat they had and tucked him close. The road stretched wide and white under the snow, wagon wheels cutting clean through the drift. They passed only 2 riders on the trail, both heading east with bedrolls and rifles. Oran tipped his hat and the men nodded, but nothing passed between them. "You ever think of leaving Montana?" she asked, watching the pines blur past. "Once," he said, "when Pa first died. Thought about going to Dakota Territory, but I had this land and I figured if I didn't stay, no one would." "Was it hard, keeping it all alone?" "Some days. But it gets easier when you stop expecting it to be anything else." She thought about that for a while, watching the road curve around a frozen creek. "I used to think I'd marry someone who read books and wore polished boots. Turns out, I don't miss either." He smiled without turning his head. "And what do you like instead?" "Someone who knows how to mend a fence and doesn't ask me to be quiet when I've got something to say." They rode the rest of the way without much talk, but the silence sat easy between them. Town was quiet under the snow smoke rising from chimneys, windows fogged with heat. Oran helped her down and carried Paul in his arms while she walked beside him. The mercantile was warm and smelled of kerosene and molasses. Beatrice took her time, measuring out flour and choosing a tin of peppermint drops with her own coin. A woman near the counters looked up from her bolt of fabric and watched them. Her smile was small, cautious. "You're Oran Keller's woman, then?" she asked. "I keep house out at the ranch," Beatrice said simply. The woman nodded. "I was wondering who'd finally tamed him." "He doesn't need taming," Beatrice said. "Just someone who stays." The woman said nothing else, just turned back to her fabric. Outside, Oran was tying the sacks down in the wagon bed. Paul slept against his chest, one small hand tucked into Oran's coat. Beatrice stepped up beside them and reached to adjust the blanket. "You ready?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "More than I thought." The ride back was slower, the snow deeper now, but the air was calm. As the sky dimmed, Beatrice laid her head against the sideboard, Paul asleep in her arms again, and Oran humming low under his breath. When they reached the cabin, it was cold, the hearth dark. Beatrice moved quickly, setting Paul in the cradle and striking the match while Oran brought in the sacks. They worked without words, practiced now in the rhythm of returning. Later, once the fire had caught and the potatoes were on to boil, Oran stood near the stove, fingers laced behind his back. "That woman at the store," he said, "her name's Jean. She's known me since I was a boy." "She meant no harm," Beatrice said. "People talk, it's what they do." "I don't care what they say," he said, "but I want you to know something." She turned from the hearth. "All right. I'm not offering you a place out of pity. I've come to count on your voice in the morning, your hands in the work, your boys' cry at night. This house didn't feel like much before. Now it does." She stepped closer, firelight catching the edge of her collar. "I don't need promises yet. But I want to know you mean to stay." "I do," he said. "With both of you." Then he reached for her hand, not sudden, not unsure, and she let him take it. Their fingers folded together like they'd been doing so for years. Outside, the snow kept falling. Inside, the kettle whistled. Paul stirred once and settled again. And in the stillness that followed, something strong and quiet took root. A thaw came early that spring. The snow shrank back from the fields in slow, wet sighs, and the earth beneath turned soft and dark. Oran traded out the sled runners on the wagon for wheels, and Beatrice strung a braided rope across the porch to dry herbs she'd foraged near the creeked yarrow, wild mint, and the last brittle stalks of horehound. Paul had learned to sit up on his own and liked to press his palms to the windowpane, watching birds land in the bare branches. His hair had taken on a copper sheen in the sunlight, and when he laughed rare but bright, it sounded like something new being born. One morning, Oran stepped in from the barn with mud up to his calves and a folded paper in hand. He shook the rain from his hat and passed her the letter. "It's from a land agent," he said. "Name's Barrick. Wants to buy the north pasture to run cattle through. Says he's willing to pay fair." Beatrice wiped her hands on her apron and unfolded the page. "You thinking of selling?" "Not without asking you first." She looked up. "It's your land. I've shared every hour of it with you since you came. That makes it yours too, far as I figure." She read the letter again, slower this time. "If you sold it, what would you do with the money?" He leaned his hip against the table. "Build a second room. Put a door between it and the main, maybe frame in a real pantry. I thought about fencing the eastern edge, keeping the mule from wandering again." Beatrice folded the letter. "You'd sell a piece of what your father left you. I'm not tied to every acre. I'm tied to what we've made here." She looked at the hearth. "Then let's use it to make more." He nodded, once, like it had already been decided. That same afternoon, Oran hitched the wagon and rode out to meet the agent. Beatrice stayed behind, settling Paul on a blanket among the crocuses. She knelt nearby, turning soil with a stick marking rows for late carrots and yellow onions. The air smelled of damp bark and thawing moss, and when she looked up, Paul had a fistful of petals and a wide-eyed grin. She didn't scold him, just laughed softly and brushed the dirt from his cheek. Oran returned near dusk with a signed note and a pouch of coin. Instead of saying anything, he crouched beside her in the garden plot, pressed his hands into the soil and said, "It's good ground." "We'll make it better," she said. That night, they sat on the porch while Paul slept inside. The stars came out slow, blinking through the haze like they were shaking off winter too. Oran reached over, curled his fingers around hers and ran his thumb along her knuckles. "I've been thinking," he said. "A man can build a place and keep it running, but it doesn't mean much unless he's building it for something." She turned to him. "You've built something already. I want to give it your name." Her breath caught, not from surprise but from the quiet certainty behind his words. "You mean to marry me?" "I do. I want it written down and spoken plain. I want Paul to grow up knowing he belongs to two people who chose each other without flinching." She didn't answer right away, just leaned against him and let the warmth of his shoulder settle through her. "Yes," she said. "I want that too." They married under the sycamore that stood beyond the barn, the ground still soft beneath their boots. Beatrice wore a dress she'd let down at the hem and trimmed with lace from her old petticoat. Oran shaved close and wore a clean shirt with a patch she'd sewn near the collar. The town's preacher came out in a buggy, his wife holding the baby during the vows. No guests, no music. Just sunlight, wind, and the quiet sound of cattle lowing in the distance. Afterward, they shared bread and pickled pears on the porch, Paul nestled between them in a quilt. Oran poured cider into tin cups, and they drank to the land, the home, and the new name carved into the lintel above the door. Weeks passed. Beatrice planted a garden that stretched 2 rows longer than the last. Oran built the second room, hammering careful, deliberate strokes until the frame stood square and strong. Paul took his first steps between them, tiny and unsteady, but certain. One evening, Oran carried Paul in from the field, the boy asleep against his shoulder, and laid him gently in the cradle near the hearth. Beatrice stirred the stew, her hair pinned in a loose knot, her sleeves rolled. Oran watched her for a long moment, then crossed the room and wrapped his arms around her from behind. "This is what I wanted," he said, his voice low. She leaned back into him, her hand still on the spoon. "This is what we made." Outside, spring settled fully over the land. Lambs bleated on neighboring hills and the chokecherry trees bloomed delicate white. Inside, the fire burned steady and the house was full. Nothing extravagant, nothing easy but whole. And that, at last, was everything.